So, what are some influences on the legislative process in the state of California? Influencing legislation can be a complicated business. There's no high tech computer model that can predict whether a bill introduced in the legislature will become a law, and if so, what form it will actually take. But we do know some influences that regularly shape state legislation here in California. So I wanted to take a look at some of the key factors that ought to be considered when crafting strategies to advocate for or against legislation. When capital observers consider legislation, they generally start with three basic questions. What's the current law? What should the law be? And what are the politics of the situation? Now, in order to influence legislators, it's important to delve deep into how each lawmaker's unique views and circumstances determine how that legislator may actually assess the policy, fiscal, and political implications of a proposed measure. Now, the following list I'm going to go through here is certainly not comprehensive, but it gives you an idea of some of the potential influences that might affect a lawmaker's decision, which generally comes down to deliberation, some political bargaining, and perhaps even the personal or district motivations of individual legislators who ultimately have to cast a vote in favor or against a bill. So, what are these different influences? Political party is one. I think one of the biggest influences and most reliable indicator or predictor of a legislator's vote is their party affiliation. Legislators often inquiry about the position of their party caucuses, whether Republican or Democrat, and the vote recommendation of those individual caucuses. Lawmakers frequently may not have firsthand knowledge about a deep understanding of the substance of a measure. So these caucus recommendations are often important influences. Now, not all legislators follow their caucus position because sometimes these are difficult decisions and they might have to depart from what is expected from their party to something else. Now, one job of a lobbyist who's aligned with a caucus's position is obviously to try and get the legislator to hold to that caucus position. But of course, an advocate who is seeking a vote that's at odds with the position of a lawmaker's caucus will face a much more difficult task. Another influence is the lawmaker's district. It's crucial for a legislator to obviously take into consideration the needs and interests and views of his or her district and the constituents of that legislator. So, is the legislator voting his or her district? On a controversial measure, a lawmaker will certainly consider the potential political implications and the impact on that legislator for proposed legislation being considered. So, how will the vote on the bill impact the legislator in his or her district? Sometimes legislators face very difficult choices when the views, for example, of their district might be at odds with a party caucus position, for example, or a powerful interest group. Another influence is the legislative leadership. Obviously, the leader of the legislative chamber sometimes has the most influence of any of their colleagues, of any other legislator. So, sometimes the legislative leader's support or opposition will carry the day with members, many members of his or her caucus. At other times, a legislator may be persuaded by some other factor, but I'm sure that a leader's position on a measure will weigh heavily, particularly when they're of the same political party. Now, leadership styles in the Assembly and Senate obviously vary over time, with some leaders demanding great caucus loyalty, sometimes more than others. And of course, a lobbyist needs to be aware of this dynamic and how influential a legislative leader is and where do they want to exert their leadership or their power. Interest groups, of course, are another influence. A legislator may be friendly with one or more key interest groups involved in your legislation. This may be based upon a personal level of trust of a particular group, or it could be based on some political realities. So naturally, legislators want to know how different interest groups view a particular legislative proposal. And sometimes one of the initial questions a legislator might ask is, who supports this bill? Who opposes this bill? Regardless whether it's the initial question, legislators will want to know the importance of an issue or a bill to particular interest groups of concern to them. In other words, is the bill a priority, or is it a bill on which they simply have taken a position but are not actively lobbying one way or the other? Another influence on a legislator naturally is their personal philosophy. Perhaps a legislator views a particular public policy issue based upon their own political beliefs. Perhaps a governing philosophy really dictates how a lawmaker will vote. So, what is the individual's political ideology and view on policy issues? Sometimes religion plays a role on certain issues. Perhaps there are other factors, geographic or regional items, their gender, their ethnicity. Perhaps the legislator has had some personal or professional experiences in their life that might influence their thinking about a particular issue or stand that they want to take. Another influence on legislative decision making are colleagues of the legislator. How a legislator views another member of his or her chamber or political party may also be a determining factor. Sometimes, when the fellow legislator, for example, is a committee chair or represents a particular area of the state or has specific subject matter expertise, that could be very influential. For example, if a legislator knows little about a bill, he or she might seek out the guidance or wisdom of a colleague who has more experience or information about the topic. Also, personal working relationships with colleagues is often key. This can result in votes on controversial measures or can pave the way for a compromise or even block one. Another influence are the rules. For example, the vote requirements or other procedural hurdles that a measure has to take through the legislative process can sometimes affect how a legislator may vote on a bill. For example, there's a supermajority vote requirement for tax increase measures in California. This need of this higher vote threshold to be met may influence one party or both parties and how individual legislators will actually vote. Another big influence is the governor, particularly one of the same party. The governor can sign or veto bills, and so obviously has considerable influence over shaping legislation. For example, does the bill have support or opposition from the chief executive? Is the governor of the same political party as a particular legislator? Has the governor privately or publicly staked out a position on this bill or this public policy area? And last but not least, another influence naturally is public opinion. Certainly, the opinion of the general public and constituents in particular can influence a legislator. Has the media or statewide media or the blogosphere written about the issue or covered it? Is there any public opinion polling available? What is deemed to be the majority position of the electorate? Have there been op-eds or opinion editorials published, say, in the local newspaper? And if so, what position on the bill or policy issue do those op-eds advocate? As you've heard, there are numerous factors that can and do influence how legislators may vote on a bill or view a public policy area. There are often so many, in fact, that it's difficult to determine which of these different factors and many more have the most direct impact. Another complicating factor is that these are often fluid and influences can vary with different legislators at different times on different measures. In other words, one bill may be most influenced by a personal connection or the governor weighing in, while a vote on the next bill will be decided exclusively on its impact to the legislator's district. But as you heard, there are quite a few different influences that can impact legislative decision-making here in the California legislature and elsewhere.